lived lives little better than those of the monkeys in the forest, and committed habitually the most fearful crimes without any clear notion that they were doing wrong, while the upper classes, to judge from the literature which they have left, were so coarse and so profligate, in spite of nobler instincts and a higher sense of duty, that the purest and justest spirits among them had again and again to flee from their own class into the cloister or the hermit's cell. In those days it was found necessary to ask Christian people perpetually, "Have you been doing this or that?" For if you have, you are not only unfit to be called a Christian, you are unfit to be called a decent human being. And this, because there was every reason to suppose that they had been doing it, and that they would not tell of themselves if they could possibly avoid it. So the confessional arose as a necessary element for educating savages into common morality and decency. And for the same reasons we employ it among the Negroes of Trinidad. Have no fears lest we should corrupt the minds of the young. They see and hear more harm daily than we could ever teach them, were we so devilishly minded. There is vice now, rampant and notorious in Port of Spain, which eludes even our confessional. Let us alone to do our best. God knows we are trying to do it according to our light. If any Roman Catholic clergyman in Port of Spain spoke thus to me, and I have been spoken to in words not unlike these, I could only answer, "God's blessing on you and all your efforts, whether I agree with you in detail or not." The Roman Catholic inhabitants of the island are to the Protestant as about 2.5 to 1. The whole of the more educated portion of them, as far as I could ascertain, are willing to entrust the education of their children to the clergy. The Archbishop of Trinidad, Monsignor Gonan, who has jurisdiction also in St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada and Tobago, is a man not only of great energy and devotion, but of cultivation and knowledge of the world, having, I was told, attained distinction as a barrister elsewhere before he took holy orders. A group of clergy is working under him, among them a personal friend of mine, able and ready to do their best to mend a state of things in which most of the children in the island, born nominal Roman Catholics, but the majority illegitimate, were growing up not only in ignorance but in heathendom and brutality. Meanwhile, the clergy were in want of funds. There were no funds at all, indeed, which would enable them to set up in remote forest districts a religious school side by side with the secular ward school, and the colony could not well be asked for government grants to 2 sets of schools at once. In face of these circumstances, the late governor thought fit to take action on the very able and interesting report of Mr. J.P. Keenan, one of the chiefs of inspection of the Irish National Board of Education, who had been sent out as a special commissioner to inquire into the state of education in the island. To modify Lord Harris's plan, however excellent in itself, and to pass an ordinance by which government aid was extended to private elementary schools of whatever denomination, provided they had duly certificated teachers, were accessible to all children of the neighbourhood without distinction of religion or race, and offered solid guarantees for abstinence from proselytism and intolerance by subjecting their rules and course of teaching to the Board of Education, and empowering that board at any moment to cancel the certificate of the teacher. In the wards in which such schools were founded and proved to be working satisfactorily, the secular ward schools were to be discontinued, but the government reserved to itself the power of reopening a secular school in the ward in case the private school turned out a failure. Such is a short sketch of an ordinance which seems to me at least a rational and fair compromise, identical mutatis mutandis with that embodied in Mr. Forster's New Education Act, and the only one by which the lower orders of Trinidad were likely to get any education whatever. It was received, of course, with applause by the Roman Catholics and by a great number of the Protestants of the colony. But, as was to be expected, it met with strong expressions of dissent from some of the Protestant gentry and clergy, especially from one gentleman who attacked the new scheme with an acuteness and humour which made even those who differed from him regret that such remarkable talents had no wider sphere than a little island of 45 miles by 60. An accession of power to the Roman Catholic clergy was, of course, dreaded, and all the more because it was known that the scheme met with the approval of the Archbishop, that it was indeed a compromise with the requests made in a petition which that prelate had lately sent in to the governor, a petition which seems to me most rational and temperate. It was argued, too, that through the existing Act, that of 1851, had more or less failed, it might still succeed if Lord Harris's plan was fully carried out, and the choice of the ward schoolmaster, the selection of ward school books, and the direction of the course of instruction were vested in local committees. The simple answer was that 18 years had elapsed and the colony had done nothing in that direction, that the great majority of children in the island did not go to school at all, while those who did attended most irregularly and learnt little or nothing, that the secular system of education had not attracted as it was hoped. The children of the Hindu immigrants, of whom scarcely one was to be found in a ward school, that the ward schoolmasters were generally inefficient, and the Central Board of Education inactive, that there was no rigorous local supervision and no local interest felt in the schools, that there were fewer children in the ward schools in 1868 than there had been in 1863, in spite of the rapid increase of population, and all this for the simple reason which the Archbishop had pointed out, the want of religious instruction. As was to be expected, the good people of the island, being most of them religious people also, felt no enthusiasm about schools where little was likely to be taught beyond the 3 royal R's. I believe they were wrong. Any teaching which involves moral discipline is better than mere anarchy and idleness. But they had a right to their opinion, and a right, too, being the great majority of the islanders, to have that opinion respected by the governor. Even now it will be but too likely, I think, that the establishment and superintendence of schools in remote districts will devolve, as it did in Europe during the Middle Age, entirely on the different clergies, simply by default of laymen of sufficient zeal for the welfare of the coloured people. Be that as it may, the ordinance has become law, and I have faith enough in the loyalty of the good folk of Trinidad to believe that they will do their best to make it work. If indeed the present ordinance does not work, it is difficult to conceive any that will. It seems exactly fitted for the needs of Trinidad. I do not say that it is fitted for the needs of any and every country. In Ireland, for instance, such a system would be, in my opinion, simply retrograde. The Irishman, to his honour, has passed centuries since beyond the stage at which he requires to be educated by a priesthood in the primary laws of religion and morality. His morality is, on certain important points, superior to that of almost any people. What he needs is to be trained to loyalty and order, to be brought more in contact with the secular science and civilization of the rest of Europe, and that must be done by a secular and not by an ecclesiastical system of education. The higher education in Trinidad seems in a more satisfactory state than the elementary. The young ladies, many of them, go home, i.e. to England or France, for their schooling, and some of the young men to Oxford, Cambridge, London or Edinburgh. The Gilchrist Trust of the University of London has lately offered annually a scholarship of £100 a year for 3 years to lads from the West Indian colonies, the examinations for it to be held in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Demerara, and in Trinidad itself 2 exhibitions of £150 a year each, tenable for 3 years, are attainable by lads of the Queen's Collegiate School to help them toward their studies at a British university. The Collegiate School received aid from the state to the amount of £3,000 per annum, less by the students' fees, and was opened to all denominations. But in it, again, the secular system would not work. The great majority of Roman Catholic lads were educated at St. Mary's College, which received no state aid at all. 417 Catholic pupils at the former school, as against 111 at the latter, were, as Mr. Keenan says, a poor expression of confidence or favour on the part of the colonists. The Roman Catholic religion was the creed of the great majority of the islanders, and especially of the wealthier and better educated of the coloured families. Justice seemed to demand that if state aid were given, it should be given to all creeds alike, and prudence certainly demanded that the respectable young man of Trinidad should not be arrayed in 2 alien camps, in which the differences of creed were intensified by those of race, and, in one camp at least, by a sense of something very like injustice on the part of a Protestant, and, it must always be remembered, originally conquering government. To give the lads as much as possible the same interests, the same views, to make them all alike feel that they were growing up, not merely English subjects, but English men, was one of the most important social problems in Trinidad, and the simplest way of solving it was to educate them as much as possible side by side in the same school on the same terms of perfect equality. The late governor, therefore, with the advice and consent of his council, determined to develop the Queen's Collegiate School into a new royal college, which was to be open to all creeds and races without distinction, but upon such terms as will, it is hoped, secure the willing attendance of Roman Catholic scholars. Not only it, but schools affiliated to it are to receive government aid, and 4 exhibitions of £150 a year each, instead of 2 are granted to young men going home to a British university. The college was inaugurated, I am sorry to say, after I had left the island, in June 1870, by the governor, in the presence of, to quote the Port of Spain Gazette, the council consisting of the Honourable the Chief Judge Needham, J. Scott Bush, Colonial Secretary, Charles W. Warner, C.B., E. J. Eagles, F. Warner, Dr. L. A. Vertoy, Henry Court, M. Maxwell Phillip, His Honour Mr. Justice Fitzgerald, Andre Bernard, Esquire. The last 5 of these gentlemen being, I believe, Roman Catholics. Most of the Board of Education were also present. The principal and masters of the Collegiate School, the superiors and reverend professors of St. Mary's College, the clergy of the Church of England in the island, the leading professional men and merchants, etc., and especially a large number of Roman Catholic gentry of the island. M. Ambar, O'Connor, Giuseppe, Laney, Farfan, Gillino, Rat, Pantin, Leotaud, Besson, Fraser, Paul, Hobson, Garcia, Dr. Padron, etc. I quote their names from the Gazette in the order in which they occur. Many of them I have not the honour of knowing, but judging of those whom I do not know by those whom I do, I should say that their presence at the inauguration was a solid proof that the foundation of the new college was a just and politic measure, opening, as the Gazette well says, a great future to the youth of all creeds in the colony. The late Governor's speech on the occasion I shall print entire. It will explain the circumstances of the case far better than I can do, and it may possibly meet with interest and approval from those who like to hear the sound sense spoken, even in a small colony. We are met here today to inaugurate the Royal College, an institution in which the benefits of a sound education, I trust, will be secured to Protestants and Roman Catholics alike, without the slightest compromise of their respective principles. The Queen's Collegiate School, of which this college is, in some sort, an outgrowth and development, was founded with the same object. But, successful as it has been in other respects, it cannot be said to have altogether attained this. St. Mary's College was founded by private enterprise, with a different view and to meet the wants of those who objected to the collegiate school. It has long been felt the existence of two colleges, one the smaller, almost entirely supported by the state, the other, the larger, wholly without state aid, was objectionable, and that the whole question of secondary education presented a most difficult problem. Some saw its solution in the withdrawal of all state aids from higher education, others in the establishment by the state of two distinct denominational colleges. I have elsewhere explained the reason why I consider both these suggestions faulty, and their probable effect bad, the one being certain to check and discourage superior education altogether, the other likely to substitute inefficient for efficient teaching, and small exclusive schools for a wide national institution. I knew that while insuperable objections existed to a combined education in all subjects, that objection had its limits, that in America and in Germany I had seen Protestants and Catholics learning side by side, that in Mauritius a college numbering 700 pupils, partly Protestants, partly Roman Catholics, existed, and that similar establishments were not uncommon elsewhere. I therefore determined to endeavour to effect the establishment of a college where combined study might be carried on in those branches of education with respect to which no objection to such a course was felt, and to support with government aid and bring under government supervision those establishments where those branches in which a separate education was deemed necessary were taught. I had, when last at home, some anxious conferences with the highest ecclesiastical authority of the Roman Catholic Church in England on the subject, and came to a complete understanding with him in respect to it. Himself a man of the highest university eminence, is not one to be indifferent to the interests of learning, afford a guarantee that nothing sanctioned by him could, even by the most scrupulous, be considered in the least degree inconsistent with the interests of his church or his religion, for a totally separate education, but candidly admitted the objections to such a course in a small and not very wealthy island, and drew a wide distinction between combination for all purposes and for some only. There were certain courses of instruction in which combined instruction could not possibly be given consistently with due regard to the faith of the pupils. There were others where it was difficult to decide whether it could or could not properly be given. There are others again where it might be certainly given without objection. On this understanding, the plan carried into effect is based, but the legislature have gone far beyond what was then agreed, and whilst Archbishop Manning would have assented to an arrangement which would have excluded certain branches only of education from the common course, the law as now in force allows exemption from attendance on all, provided competent instruction is given to the pupils in the same branches elsewhere, till in fact all that remains obligatory is attendance at examinations and at the course of instruction in one or more of 4 given branches of education, if it should so happen that no adequate teaching in that particular branch is given in the pupil's own school. A scheme more liberal, a bond more elastic, could hardly have been devised, capable of effecting, if desired, the closest union, capable of being stretched to almost any degree of slight connection. And even if some Catholics would still prefer a wholly separate system, they must, if candid men, admit that the Protestant population here have a right to demand that they should not be called on to surrender, in order to satisfy a mere preference, the great advantages they derive from a united college under state control, with its efficient staff and national character. If religious difficulties are met and conscientious scruples are not wounded, a sacrifice of preferences must often be made. Private wishes must often yield to the public good. In the first instance, all the boys of the former collegiate school have become students of the college, but probably a school of a similar character, but affiliated to the college, will shortly be formed, in which a large number of those boys will be included. That the headship of the college should be entrusted to the principal of the Queen's Collegiate School will, I am sure, be universally felt to be only a just tribute to the zeal, efficiency and success with which he has hitherto laboured in his office, whilst, in addition to these qualifications, he possesses the no less important one for the post he is about to fill, of a mind singularly impartial, just, liberal and candid. I hope that the other professors of the college may be taken from affiliated schools indiscriminately, the lectures being given as may be most convenient and as may be arranged by the college council. It is intended by the college council that the fees charged for attendance at the Royal College should be much lower than those heretofore charged at the Queen's Collegiate School. I do not believe that the mere financial loss will be great, whilst I believe a good education will, by this means, be placed within the reach of many who cannot now afford it. I hope, but I express only my own personal wish, not that of the Council, which, as yet, has pronounced no opinion, that some of the changes introduced in most state of modern education will be made here, and that especial attention will be given to the teaching of some of the Eastern languages. It is almost impossible to overrate the importance of this both to the government and the community. To the government, as enabling it to avail itself of the services of honest, competent and trustworthy interpreters, and to the general community as relieving both employer and employed from the necessity of depending on the interpretation of men not always very competent nor always very scrupulous, whose mistakes or errors, whether wilful or accidental, may often effect much injustice, and on whose fidelity life may not infrequently depend. I thank the members of the College Council for having accepted a task which will, at first, involve much delicate tact, forbearance, caution and firmness, and the exercise of talents I know them to possess, and which I am confident will be freely bestowed in working out the success of the institution committed to their care. I thank the Principal and his staff for their past exertions, and I count with confidence on their future labours. I thank the parents who, by their presence, have manifested their interest in our undertaking and their wishes for its success, and I especially thank the ladies who have been drawn within these walls by graver attractions than those which generally bring us together at this building. I rejoice to see here the Superior of St. Mary's College and the goodly array of those under his charge, and I do so for many reasons. I rejoice because, being not as yet affiliated or in any way officially connected with the Royal College, their presence is a spontaneous evidence of their goodwill and kindly feeling, and of the spirit in which they have been disposed to meet the efforts made to consult their feelings in the arrangements of this institution. A spirit yet further evinced by the fact that the Superior has informed me that he is about voluntarily to alter the course of study pursued in St. Mary's College so as more nearly to assimilate it to that pursued here. I rejoice because in their presence I hail a sign that the affiliation which is, I believe, desired by the great body of the Roman Catholic community in this island, and to which it has been shown no insuperable religious obstacle exists, will take place at no more distant day than is necessary to secure the approval, the naturally requisite approval, of ecclesiastical authority elsewhere. I rejoice at their presence because it enables me before this company to express my high sense of the courage and liberality which have maintained their college for years past without any aid whatever from the state, and, in spite of manifold obstacles and discouragements, have caused it to increase in numbers and efficiency. I rejoice at their presence because I desire to see the youth of Trinidad of every race, without indifference to their respective creeds, brought together on all possible occasions, whether for recreation or for work, because I wish to see them engaged in friendly rivalry in their studies now, as they will hereafter be in the world, which I desire to see them enter, not as strangers to each other, but as friends and fellow citizens. I rejoice because their presence enables me to take a personal farewell of so many of those who will in the next generation be the planters, the merchants, the official and professional men of Trinidad. By the time that you are men, all the petty jealousies, all the mean resentments of this our day will have faded into the oblivion which is their proper bourne. But the work now accomplished will not, I trust, so fade. They will melt and perish as the snow of the north would before our tropical sun. But the college will, I trust, remain as the rock on which the snow rests, and which remains uninjured by the heat, unmoved by the passing storm. May it endure and strengthen as it passes from the first feeble beginnings of this its infancy to a vigorous youth and maturity. You will sometimes in days to come recall the inauguration of your college, and perhaps not forget that its founder prayed you to bear in mind the truth that you will find even now the truest satisfaction in the strict discharge of duty, that he urged you to form high and unselfish aims, to seek noble and worthy objects, and as you enter on the world and all its tossing sea of jealousies, strife, division, and distrust, to heed the lesson which an apostle, whose words we all alike revere, has taught us: if ye bite and devour one another, take ye heed that ye be not consumed one of another. Here, we hope, a point of union has been found which may last through life, and that whilst every man cherishes a love for his own peculiar school, all alike will have an interest in their common college, all alike be proud of a national institution, jealous of its honour and eager to advance its welfare. It is a common thing to hear the bitterness and religious discord here deplored. I, for one, looking back on the history of past years, cannot think, as some seem to do, that it has increased. On the contrary, it seems to me that it has greatly diminished in violence when displayed, and that its displays are far less frequent. Such, I believe, will be more and more the case, and that whilst religious distinctions will remain the same, and conscientious convictions unaltered, social and party differences consequent on those distinctions and convictions will daily diminish, that all alike will more and more feel in how many things they can think and act together for the benefit of their common country and of the community of which they are all members. How they can be glad together in her prosperity and be sad together in the day of her distress, and work together at all times to promote her good. That this college is calculated to aid in a great degree in effecting this happy result, I for one cannot entertain the shadow of a doubt. Esto perpetua. Esto perpetua, but there remains, I believe, more yet to be done for education in the West Indies, and that is to carry out Mr. Keenan's scheme for a central university for the whole of the West Indian colonies, as a focus of higher education, and a focus also of cultivated public opinion, round which all that is shrewdest and noblest in the islands shall rally, and find strength in moral and intellectual union. I earnestly recommend all West Indians to ponder Mr. Keenan's weighty words on this matter, believing that, as they do so, even stronger reasons than he has given for establishing such an institution will suggest themselves to West Indian minds. I am not aware, nor would the reader care much to know, what schools there may be in Port of Spain for Protestant young ladies. I can only say that, to judge from the young ladies themselves, the schools must be excellent. But one school in Port of Spain I am bound in honour, as a clergyman of the Church of England, not to pass by without earnest approval, namely the Convent, as it is usually called. It was established in 1836 under the patronage of the Roman Catholic Bishop, the Right Reverend Dr. MacDonald, and was founded by the Ladies of St. Joseph, a religious sisterhood which originated in France a few years since for the special purpose of diffusing instruction through the colonies. This institution, which Dr. de Verteuil says is unique in the West Indies, besides keeping up 2 large girls' schools for poor children, gave in 1857 a higher education to 120 girls of middle and upper classes, and the number has much increased since then. It is impossible to doubt that this convent has been a blessing to the colony. At the very time when, just after slavery was abolished, society throughout the island was in the greatest peril, these good ladies came to supply a want which, under the peculiar circumstances of Trinidad, could only have been supplied by the self-sacrifice of devoted women. The convent has not only spread instruction and religion among the wealthier coloured class, but it has done more. It has been a centre of true civilization, purity, virtue, where one was but too much needed, and has preserved, doubtless, hundreds of young creatures from serious harm, and that without interfering in any wise, I should think, with their duty to their parents. On the contrary, Many a mother in Port of Spain must have found in the convent a protection for her daughters, better than she herself could give, against influences to which she herself had been but too much exposed during the evil days of slavery, influences which are not yet, alas, extinct in Port of Spain. Creoles will understand my words, and will understand too why I, Protestant though I am, bid heartily Godspeed to the good ladies of St. Joseph. To the Anglican clergy, meanwhile, whom I met in the West Indies, I am bound to offer my thanks, not for courtesies shown to me, that is a slight matter, but for the worthy fashion in which they seem to be upholding the honour of the good old church in the colonies. In Port of Spain I heard and saw enough of their work to believe that they are in no wise less active. More active they cannot be than if they were seaport clergymen in England. The services were performed thoroughly well, with a certain stateliness which is not only allowable but necessary in a colony where the majority of the congregation are coloured, but without the least foppery or extravagance. The very best sermon, perhaps, for matter and manner, which I ever heard preached to unlettered folk, was preached by a young clergyman, a West Indian born, in the great church of Port of Spain, and he had no lack of hearers, and those attentive ones. The great church was always a pleasant sight, with its crowded congregation of every hue, all well dressed and with universal West Indian look of comfort, and its noble span of roof overhead, all cut from island timber, another proof of what the woodcarver may effect in the island hereafter. Certainly distractions were frequent and troublesome, at least to a newcomer. A larger centipede would come out and take a hurried turn around the governor's seat, or a bat would settle in broad daylight in the curate's hood, or one had to turn away one's eyes lest they should behold, not vanity, but the magnificent head of a cabbage palm just outside the opposite window, with the black vultures trying to sit on the footstalks in a high wind, and slipping down and flopping up again, half the service through. But one soon got accustomed to the strange sights, though it was, to say the least, somewhat startling to find on Christmas Day the altar and pulpit decked with exquisite tropic flowers, and each doorway arched over with a single pair of coconut leaves, 15 feet high. The Christmas Day communion, too, was one not easily to be forgotten. At least 250 persons, mostly coloured, many as black as jet, attended, and were, I may say for them, most devout in manner. Pleasant it was, too, to see the large proportion of men among them, many young white men of the middle and upper class, and still more pleasant, too, to see that all hues and ranks knelt side by side without the least distinction. One trio touched me deeply. An old lady, I know not who she was, with the unmistakable, long, delicate, once beautiful features of a high-bred West Indian of the Ancien Régime, came and knelt reverently, feebly, sadly between two old Negro women. One of them seemed her maid. Both of them might have been once her slaves. Here at least they were equals. True equality, the consecration of humility, not the consecration of envy, first appeared on earth in the house of God and at the altar of Christ, and I question much whether it will linger long in any spot on earth where that house and that altar are despised. It is easy to propose an equality without Christianity, as easy as to propose to kick down the ladder by which you have climbed, or to saw off the bough on which you sit. As easy and as safe. But I must not forget, while speaking of education in Trinidad, one truly educational establishment which I visited at Tacarigua, namely a coolie orphan home, assisted by the state, but set up and kept up almost entirely by the zeal of one man, the Reverend Richards, brother of the excellent rector of Trinity Church, Port of Spain. This good man, having no children of his own, has taken for his children the little brown immigrants, who, losing father and mother, are but too apt to be neglected by their own folk. At the foot of the mountains, beside a clear, swift stream, amid scenery and vegetation which an European millionaire might envy, he has built a smart little triangle, with a low, long house on one side for the girls, and on the other for the boys, a schoolroom which was as well supplied with books, maps, and pictures as any average national school in England, and, adjoining the buildings, a garden where the boys are taught to work. A matron, who seemed thoroughly worthy of her post, conducts the whole, and comfort, cleanliness, and order were visible everywhere. A pleasant sight, but the pleasantest sight of all was to see the little bright-eyed brown darlings clustering round him who was indeed their Father in God, who had delivered them from misery and loneliness, and, in the case of the girls, too probably vice likewise, and drawn them by love to civilization and Christianity. The children, as fast as they grow up, are put out to domestic service, and the great majority of the boys, at least, turn out well. The girls, I was told, are curiously inferior to the boys in intellect and force of character, an inferiority which is certainly not to be found in Negroes, among whom the two sexes are more on a par, not only intellectually but physically also, than among any race which I have seen. One instance, indeed, we saw of the success of the school. A young curate, brought up there and well married nearby, came in during our visit to show off her first baby to the matron and the children. As pretty a mother and babe as one could well see. Only we regretted that, in obedience to the supposed demands of civilization and of a rise in life, she had discarded the graceful and modest Hindu dress of her ancestresses for a French bonnet and all that accompanies it. The transfiguration added, one must charitably suppose, to her self-respect. If so, it must be condoned on moral grounds, but in an aesthetic view she had made a great mistake. In remembrance of our visit, a little brown child, some 3 or 4 years old, who had been christened that day, was named after me, and I was glad to have my name connected, even in so minute an item, with an institution which, at all events, delivers children from the fancy that they can, without being good or doing good, conciliate the upper powers by hanging garlands on a trident inside a hut, or putting red dust on a stump of wood outside it, while they stare in and mumble prayers to they know not what of gilded wood. The coolie temples are curious places to those who have never before been face to face with real heathendom. Their mark is, generally, a long bamboo with a pennon atop, outside a low dark hut with a broad flat veranda, or rather shed, outside the door. Under the latter, opposite each door, if I recollect rightly, is a stone or small stump, on which offerings are made of red dust and flowers. From it the worshippers can see the images within. The white man, stooping, enters the temple. The attendant priest, so far from forbidding him, seems highly honoured, especially if the visitor give him a shilling and points out in the darkness, for there is no light save through the low doors, 3 or 4 squatting abominations, usually gilded. Sometimes these have been carved in the island. Sometimes the poor folk have taken the trouble to bring them all the way from India on board ship. Hung beside them on the walls are little pictures, often very well executed in the miniature-like Hindu style by native artists in the island. Large brass pots, which have some sacred meaning, stand about, and with them a curious trident-shaped stand, about 4 feet high, on the horns of which garlands of flowers are hung as offerings. The visitor is told that the male figures are Mahadeva and the female Kali. We could hear of no other deities. I leave it to those who know Indian mythology better than I do to interpret the meaning, or rather the past meaning, for I suspect it means very little now, of all this trumpery and nonsense on which the poor folk seem to spend much money. It was impossible, of course, even if one had understood their language, to find out what notions they attached to it all, and all I could do on looking at these heathen idol chapels in the midst of a Christian and civilized land was to ponder in sadness and astonishment over a puzzle as yet to me inexplicable, namely, how human beings first got into the heads the vagary of worshipping images. I fully allow the cleverness and apparent reasonableness of Monsieur Comte's now famous theory of the development of religions. I blame no one for holding it. I cannot agree with it. The more of a saine appréciation, as Monsieur Comte calls it, I bring to bear on the known facts, the more I let my thought play freely around them, the more it is inconceivable to me, according to any laws of the human intellect which I have seen at work, that savage or half-savage folk should have invented idolatries. I do not believe that fetishism is the parent of idolatry, but rather, as I have said elsewhere, that it is the dregs and remnants of idolatry. The idolatrous nations now, as always, are not the savage nations, but those who profess a very ancient and decaying civilization. The Hebrew scriptures uniformly represent the non-idolatrous and monotheistic peoples, from Abraham to Cyrus, as lower in what we now call the scale of civilization than the idolatrous and polytheistic peoples about them. May not the contrast between the patriarchs and the pharaohs, David and the Philistines, the Persians and the Babylonians, mark a law of history of wider application than we are wont to suspect? But if so, what was the parent of idolatry? For a natural genesis, it must have had, whether it be a healthy and necessary development of the human mind, as some hold, not without weighty arguments on their side, or whether it be a diseased and merely fungoid growth, as I believe it to be. I cannot hold that it originated in nature worship, simply because I can find no evidence of such an origin. There is rather evidence, if the statements of the idolaters themselves are to be taken, that it originated in the worship of superior races by inferior races, possibly also in the worship of works of art which those races dying out had left behind them, and which the lower race, while unable to copy them, believed to be possessed of magical powers derived from a civilization which they had lost. After a while, the priesthood, which has usually, in all ages and countries, proclaimed itself the depository of a knowledge and a civilization lost to the mass of people, may have gained courage to imitate these old works of art, with proper improvements for the worse, and have persuaded the people that the new idols would do as well as the old ones. Would that some truly learned man would let his thoughts play free round this view of the mystery, and see what can be made of it. But whatever is made out of it, on either view it will still remain a mystery, to me at least, as much as to Isaiah of old. How this utterly abnormal and astonishing animal called man first got into his foolish head that he could cut a thing out of wood or stone which would listen to him and answer his prayers. Yet so it is. So it has been for unnumbered ages. Man may be defined as a speaking animal or a cooking animal. He is best, I fear, defined as an idolatrous animal, and so much the worse for him. But what if that very fact, diseased as it is, should be a sure proof that he is more than an animal? Chapter 15. The Races. A Letter. Dear I have been to the races, not to bet, nor to see the horses run, not even to see the fair ladies on the grandstand, in all the newest fashions of Paris via New York, but to wander en mufti among the crowd outside, and behold the humours of men. And I must say that their humours were very good humours, far better, it seemed to me, than those of an English race ground. Not that I have set foot on one for 30 years, but at railway stations and elsewhere one cannot help seeing what manner of folk, beside mere holiday folk, rich or poor, affect English races, or help pronouncing them, if physiognomy be any test of character, for most degraded beings, even some of those smart-dressed men who carry bags with their names on them, which our pseudo-civilization has yet done itself the honour of producing. Now of that class I saw absolutely none. I do not suppose that the brown fellows who hung about the horses, whether Barbadians or Trinidad men, were of very angelic morals, but they looked like heroes compared with the bloated hangdog roughs and quasi-grooms of English races. As for the sporting gentlemen, not having the honour to know them, I can only say that they looked like gentlemen, and that I wish, in all courtesy, that they had been more wisely employed. But the Negro or the coloured man of the lower class was in his glory. He was smart, clean, shiny, happy according to his light. He got up into trees and clustered there, grinning from ear to ear. He bawled about the island horses and Barbadian horses, for the Barbadians mustered strong, and a fight was expected, which, however, never came off. He sang songs, possibly some of them extempore, like that which amused one's childhood, concerning a once notable event in a certain island. I went to da place to see da horse race. I see Mr. Barton a-whipping up his face. Run all right, run for your life. See Mr. Barton a-coming with a knife. Oh, Mr. Barton, I sorry for your loss. If you no believe me, I tie my head across. That is, go into mourning. But no one seemed inclined to tie their heads across that day. The coolies seemed as merry as the Negroes. Even about the face of the Chinese there flickered at times a feeble ray of interest. The coloured women wandered about in showy prints, great crinolines and gorgeous turbans. The coolie women sat in groups on the grass. Ah, Isle of the Blessed, where people can sit on the grass in January, like live flower beds of the most splendid and yet harmonious hues. As for jewels of gold as well as silver, there were many there, on arms, ankles, necks, and noses, which made white ladies fresh from England break the 10th commandment. I wandered about, looking at the live flower beds and giving passing glances into booths which I longed to enter, and hear what sort of human speech might be going on therein. But I was deterred, first by the thought that much of the speech might not be over-edifying, and next by the smells, especially by that most hideous of all smells, new rum. At last I came to a crowd, and in the midst of it, one of those great French merry-go-rounds turned by machinery, with pictures of languishing ladies round the central column. All the way from the Champs-Élysées, the huge piece of fool's tackle had lumbered and creaked hither across the sea to Martinique, and was now making the round of the islands, and a very profitable round to judge from the number of its customers. The hobby horses swarmed with negresses and Hindus of the lower order. The negresses, I am sorry to say, forgot themselves, kicked up their legs, shouted to the bystanders, and were altogether incondite. The Hindu women, though showing much more of their limbs than the negresses, kept them gracefully together, drew their veils round their heads, and sat coyly, half frightened, half amused, to the delight of their papas or husbands, who had in some cases to urge them to get up and ride, while they stood by, as on guard, with the long hardwood quarterstaff in hand. As I looked on, considered what a strange creature man is, and wondered what possible pleasure these women could derive from being whirled round till they were giddy and stupid, I saw an old gentleman seemingly absorbed in the very same reflection. He was dressed in dark blue with a straw hat. He stood with his hands behind his back, his knees a little bent, and a sort of wise, half-sad, half-humorous smile upon his aquiline, high-cheek-boned features. I took him for an old Scot, a canny, austere man, a man, too, who had known sorrow and profited thereby, and I drew near to him. But as he turned his head deliberately round to me, I beheld to my astonishment the unmistakable features of a Chinese. He and I looked each other full in the face, without a word, and I fancied that we understood each other about the merry-go-round and many things beside. And then we walked off different ways, as having seen enough and more than enough. Was he, after all, an honest man and true, or had he, like our sin in Mr. Bret Harte's delectable ballad, with the smile that was childlike and bland, in his sleeves, which were large, 24 packs of cards, and on his nails, which were taper, what's common in tapers? That's wax. I know not, for the Chinese visage is unfathomable. But I incline to this day to the more charitable judgment, for the man's face haunted me and haunts me still, and I am weak enough to believe that I should know the man and like him if I met him in another planet 1,000 years hence. Then I walked back under the blazing sun across the savannah, over the sensitive plants and the mole crickets' nests, while the great locusts whirred up before me at every step, toward the archway between the bamboo clumps and the red sentry shining like a spark of fire beneath its deep shadow, and found on my way a dying racehorse with a group of coloured men round him, whom I advised in vain to do the one thing needful: put a blanket over him to keep off the sun, for the poor thing had fallen from sunstroke. So I left them to jabber and do nothing, asking myself, is the human race in the matter of amusements as civilized as it was, say, 3,000 years ago? People have certainly, quite of late years, given up going to see cockfights or heretics burnt, but that is mainly because the heretics just now make the laws, in favour of themselves and the cocks. But are our amusements to be compared with those of the old Greeks, with the one exception of liking to hear really good music? Yet that fruit of civilization is barely 20 years old, and we owe its introduction, be it always remembered, to the Germans. French civilization signifies practically, certainly in the New World, little save bally girls, billiard tables and thin boots. English civilization, little save horse racing and cricket. The latter sport is certainly blameless, nay, in the West Indies, laudable and even heroic when played, as on the savannah here, under a noonday sun, which feels hot enough to cook a mutton chop. But, with all respect for cricket, one cannot help looking back at the old games of Greece and questioning whether man has advanced much in the art of amusing himself rationally and wholesomely. I had reason to ask the same question that evening as we sat in the cool veranda watching the fireflies flicker about the treetops and listening to the weary din of the tom-toms which came from all sides of the savannah, save our own, drowning the screeching and snoring of the toads and even, at times, the screams of a European band which was playing a combination tune near the grand stand half a mile off. To the music of tom-tom and chak-chak, the coloured folk would dance perpetually till 10 o'clock, after which time the rites of milita are silenced by the policeman, for the sake of quiet folk in bed. They are but too apt, however, to break out again with fresh din about 1 in the morning under the excuse, "Dis am not last night, policeman, dis am nother day." Well, but is the nightly tom-tom dance so much more absurd than the nightly ball, which is now considered an integral element of white civilization? A few centuries hence, may not both of them be looked back on as equally sheer barbarisms? These tom-tom dances are not easily seen. The only glance I ever had of them was from the steep slope of once beautiful Belmont. Sitting on a hill apart, my host and I were discoursing not of fate, free will, free knowledge absolute, but of a question almost as mysterious, the doings of the parasol ants who marched up and down their trackways past us, and whether these doings were guided by an intellect differing from ours only in degree but not in kind. 100 yards below we espied a dance in a negro garden, a few couples, mostly of women, pussetting to each other with violent and ungainly stampings, to the music of tom-tom and chak-chak, if music it can be called. Some power over the emotions it must have, for the Negroes are said to be gradually maddened by it, and white people have told me that its very monotony, if listened to long, is strangely exciting, like the monotony of a bagpipe drone or of a drum. What more went on at the dance we could not see, and if we had tried we should probably not have been allowed to see. The Negro is chary of admitting white men to his amusements, and no wonder. If a London ballroom were suddenly invaded by Phoebus, Ares and Hermes, such as Homer drew them, they would probably be unwelcome guests, at least in the eyes of the gentleman. The latter would, I suspect, thoroughly sympathize with the Negro in the old story, intelligible enough to those who know what is the favourite food of a West Indian chicken. Well, John, so they gave a dignity ball on the estate last night. Yes, massa, very nice ball. Plenty of pretty ladies, massa. Why did you not ask me, John? I like to look at pretty ladies as well as you. Ah, massa, When cockcross give a ball, him no ask the fowls. Great and worthy exertions are made every London season for the conversion of the Negro and the heathen, and the abolition of the barbarous customs and dances. It is to be hoped that the Negro and the heathen will some day show their gratitude to us by sending missionaries hither to convert the London season itself, dances and all, and to assist it to take the beam out of its own eye, in returning for having taken the mote out of theirs. Chapter 16. A Provision Ground. The provision grounds of the Negroes were very interesting. I had longed to behold, alive and growing, fruits and plants which I had heard so often named and seen so often figured, that I had expected to recognize many of them at first sight, and found in 9 cases out of 10 that I could not. Again, I had longed to gather some hints as to the possibility of carrying out in the West Indian Islands that system of petite culture, of small spade farming, which I have long regarded, with Mr. John Stuart Mills and others, as not only the ideal form of agriculture, but perhaps the basis of any ideal rustic civilization. And what scanty and imperfect facts I could collect, I set down here. It was a pleasant sensation to have day after day old names translated for me into new facts. Pleasant, at least to me. Not so pleasant, I fear, to my kind companions, whose courtesy I taxed to the utmost by stopping to look over every fence and ask, "What is that? And that?" Let the reader who has a taste for the beautiful as well as the useful in horticulture do the same and look in fancy over the hedge of the nearest provision ground. There are orange trees laden with fruit. Who knows not them? And that awkward bowed tree with huge green fruit and deeply cut leaves a foot or more across, leaves so grand that, as one of our party often suggested, their form ought to be introduced into architectural ornamentation, and to take the place of the Greek acanthus which they surpass in beauty. That is, of course, a breadfruit tree. That round-headed tree with dark rich Portugal laurel foliage arranged in stars at the end of each twig is the mango, always a beautiful object, whether in orchard or in open park. In the West Indies, as far as I have seen, the mango has not yet reached the huge size of its ancestors in Hindustan. There, to judge at least from photographs, the mango must be indeed the queen of trees, growing to the size of the largest English oak and keeping always the round oak-like form, rich in resplendent foliage and still more rich in fruit. The tree easily became encircled with an atmosphere of myth in the fancy of the imaginative Hindu. That tree with upright branches and large, dark, glossy leaves tiled upwards among them is the Mami sapota, beautiful likewise. And what is next, like an evergreen peach shedding from the underside of every leaf a golden light? Call it not shade? A star apple, and that young thing which you may often see grown in a great timber tree, with leaves like a Spanish chestnut, is the avocado, or as some call it, alligator pear. This with the glossy leaves, somewhat like the Mami sapota, is a sapodilla, and that with leaves like a great myrtle and bright flesh-coloured fruit, a Malacca apple, or perhaps a rose apple. Its neighbour with large leaves, grey and rough underneath, flowers as big as your 2 hands with greenish petals and a purple eye, followed by fat, scaly yellow apples, is the sweet sop, and that privet-like bush with little flowers and green berries, a guava, of which you may eat, if you will, as you may of the rest. The truth, however, must be told. These West Indian fruits are, most of them, still so little improved by careful culture and selection of kinds that none of them, as far as we have tried them, is to be compared with an average strawberry, plum, or pear. But how beautiful they are, all and each, after their kinds! What a joy for man to stand at his door and simply look out at them growing, leafing, blossoming, fruiting, without pause, through the perpetual summer in his little garden of the Hesperides, where, as in those of the Phoenicians of old, pear grows ripe on pear and fig on fig, for ever and for ever. Now look at the vegetables, at the banana and plantains first of all. A stranger's eye would not distinguish them. The practical difference between them is that the plantain bears large fruits which require cooking, the banana smaller and sweeter fruits which are eaten raw. As for the plant on which they grow, no mere words can picture the simple grandeur and grace of a form which startles me whenever I look steadily at it. For however common it is, none commoner here, it is so unlike aught else, so perfect in itself, that, like a palm, it might well have become in the early ages an object of worship. And who knows that it is not? Who knows that there have not been races who looked on it as the Red Indians looked on mondamin and maize plant as a gift of God, perhaps the incarnation of a god? Who knows? Whence did the ancestors of that plant come? What was its wild stock like ages ago? It is wild nowhere now on earth. It stands alone and unique in the vegetable kingdom, with distant cousins but no brother kinds. It has been cultivated so long that, though it flowers and fruits, it seldom or never seeds, and is propagated entirely by cuttings. The only spot, as far as I am aware, in which it seeds regularly and plentifully is the remote, until of late, barbarous Andaman Islands of the Bay of Bengal. There it regularly springs up in the second growth, after the forest is cleared, and bears fruits full of seed as close together as they can be pressed. How did the plant get there? Was it once cultivated there by a race superior to the now utterly savage islanders, at an epoch so remote that it had not yet lost the power of seeding? Are the Andamans its original home? Or rather, was its original home that great southern continent of which the Andamans are perhaps a remnant? Does not this fact, as well as the broader fact that different varieties of the plantain and banana girdle the earth round at the tropics, and have girdled it as long as records go back, hint at a time when there was a tropic continent or archipelago round the whole equator, and at a civilization and a horticulture to which those of old Egypt are upstarts of yesterday? There are those who never can look at the banana without a feeling of awe, as at a token of holy ancient the race of man may be, and how little we know of its history. Most beautiful it is, the lush, fat, green stem, the crown of huge leaves, falling over in curves like those of human limbs, and below, the whirls of green or golden fruit, with the purple heart of flowers dangling below them, and all so full of life that this splendid object is the product of a few months. I am told that if you cut the stem off at certain seasons, you may see the young leaf, remember that it is an endogen, and grows from within like a palm or a lily or a grass, actually move upward from within and grow before your eyes, and that each stem of plantain will bear from 30 to 60 pounds of rich food during the year of its short life. But beside the grand plantains and bananas, there are other interesting plants whose names you have often heard. The tall plant with the stem unbranched, but knotty and zigzag, and leaves atop like hemp, but of a cold purplish tinge, is the famous cassava or manioc, the old food of the Indians, poisonous till its juice is squeezed out in a curious spiral grass basket. The young laburnums, as they seem, with purple flowers, are pigeon peas, right good to eat. The creeping vines, like our tamus or black bryony, are yams, best of all roots. The branching broad-leaved canes with strange white flowers is arrowroot. The tall mallow-like shrub with large pale yellowish white flowers, cotton. The huge grass with beads on it is covered with Job's tears, which are precious in children's eyes and will be used as beads for necklaces. The castor oil plants and the maize, that last always beautiful, are of course well known. The arrow leaves 3 feet long, on stalks 3 feet high, like gigantic arums, are tanyas, whose roots are excellent. The plot of creeping convolvulus-like plants with purple flowers is the sweet or true potato. And we must not overlook the French physic nut, with its hem-like leaves and a little bunch of red coral in the midst, which the Negro loves to adorn his garden, and uses it also as medicine, or the Indian shot, which may be seen planted out now in summer gardens in England. The Negro grows it, not for its pretty crimson flowers, but because its hard seed, put into a bladder, furnishes him with that detestable musical instrument, the chak-chak, wherewith he accompanies nightly that equally detestable instrument, the tom-tom. The list of vegetables is already long, but there are a few more to be added to it, for there, in a corner, creep some plants of the earth nut, a little vetch which buries its pods in the earth. The owner will roast and eat their oily seeds. There is also a tall bunch of ochro, a purple-stemmed mallow-flowered plant, whose mucilaginous seeds will thicken his soup. Up a tree and round the house eaves scramble a large coarse pumpkin and a more delicate granadilla, whose large yellow fruits hang ready to be plucked and eaten principally for a few seeds of the shape and colour of young cockroaches. If he be a prudent man, especially if he lives in Jamaica, he will have a plant of the pretty overlook pea, trailing aloft somewhere to prevent his garden being overlooked, i.e. bewitched by an evil eye, in case the obeah bottle which hangs from the mango tree, charged with toad and spider, dirty water, and so forth, has no terrors for his secret enemy. He will have a labidibe tree too, for astringent medicine, and his hedge will be composed, if he be a man of taste, as he often seems to be, of hibiscus bushes whose magnificent crimson flowers contrast with the bright yellow bunches of the common cassia, and the scarlet flowers of the jumby bead bush, and blue and white and pink convolvuluses. The sulphur and purple Nearumbergia of our hothouses, which is here one mass of flower at Christmas, and the creeping crab's eye vine will scramble over the fence, while, as a finish to his little paradise, he will have planted at each of its four corners an upright dragon's blood bush, whose violet and red leaves bedeck our dinner tables in winter, and are here used, from their unlikeness to any other plant in the island, to mark boundaries. I have not dared, for fear of prolixity, to make this catalogue as complete as I could have done, but it must be remembered that over and above all this, every hedge and wood furnishes wild fruit, more or less eatable, the high forests plenty of oily seeds, in which the tropic man delights, and woods, forests, and fields, medicinal plants uncounted. There is more medicine in the bush, and better, than in all the shops in Port of Spain, said a wise medical man to me, and to the exhibition of 1862 Mr. McClintock alone contributed from British Guiana 140 species of barks used as medicine by the Indians. There is therefore no fear that the tropical small farmer should suffer, either from want or from monotony of food, and equally small fear lest, when his children have eaten themselves sick, as they are likely to do if, like the Negro children, they are eating all day long, he should be unable to find something in the hedge which will set them all right again. At the amount of food which a man can get off this little patch, I dare not guess. Well says Humboldt that an European lately arrived in the torrid zone is struck with nothing so much as the extreme smallness of the spots under cultivation round a cabin which contains a numerous family. The plantains alone ought, according to Humboldt, to give 133 times as much food as the same space of ground sown with wheat, and 40 times as much as if it grew potatoes. True, the plantain is by no means as nourishing as wheat, which reduces the actual difference between their value per acre to 25 to 1. But under his plantains he can grow other vegetables. He has no winter, and therefore some crop or other is always coming forward. From whence it comes, that, as I have just hinted, his wife and children seem to have always something to eat in their mouths, if it be only the berries and nuts which abound in every hedge and wood. Neither dare I guess at the profit he might make, and I hope will some day make, out of his land, if he would cultivate somewhat more for exportation and not merely for home consumption. If anyone wishes to know more on this matter, let him consult the Catalogue of Contributions from British Guiana to the London Exhibition of 1862, especially the pages from 111 to 118, on the starch-producing plants of the West Indies. Beyond the facts which I have given as to the plantain, I have no statistics of the amount of produce which is usually raised on a West Indian provision ground, nor would any be of use, for a glance shows that the limit of production has not been nearly reached. Were the fork used instead of the hoe, were the weeds kept down, were the manure returned to the soil instead of festering about everywhere in the sun and rain, in a word, were even as much done for the land as an English labourer does for his garden, still more, if as much were done for it as for a suburban market garden, the produce might be doubled or trebled, and that without exhausting the soil. The West Indian peasant can, if he will, carry la petite culture to a perfection and a wealth which is not yet attained even in China and Japan and Hindustan, and make every rood of ground not merely maintain its man, but its civilized man. This, however, will require a skill and a thoughtfulness which the Negro does not as yet possess. If he ever had them, he lost them under slavery from the brutalizing effects of a rough and unscientific grand culture, and it will need several generations of training ere he recovers them. Garden tillage and spade farming are not learnt in a day, especially when they depend, as they always must in temperate climates, for their main profit on some article which requires skilled labour to prepare it for the market. On flax, for instance, silk, wine, or fruits. An average English labourer, I fear, if put in possession of half a dozen acres of land, would fare as badly as the poor Chartists who, some 20 years ago, joined in Fergus O'Connor's land scheme, unless he knew half a dozen ways of eking out a livelihood which even our squatters around Windsor and the New Forest are, alas, forgetting, under the money-making and man-unmaking influences of the division of labour. He is vanishing fast, the old beekeeping, apple-growing, basket-making, copse-cutting, many-counselled Ulysses of our youth, as handy as sailor, and we know too well what he leaves behind him. Grandchildren, better fed, better clothed, better taught than he. But his inferiors in intellect and in manhood, because, whatever they may be taught, they cannot be taught by schooling to use their fingers and their wits. I fear, therefore, that the average English labourer would not prosper here. He has not stamina enough for the hard work of the sugar plantation. He has not wit and handiness enough for the more delicate work of a little spade farm. And he would sink, as the Negro seems inclined to sink, into a mere grower of food for himself, or take to drink, as too many of the white immigrants to certain West Indian colonies did 30 years ago, and burn the life out of himself with new rum. The Hindu immigrant, on the other hand, has been trained by long ages to a somewhat scientific agriculture, and civilized into the want of many luxuries for which the Negro cares nothing. And it is to him that we must look, I think, for a petite culture which will do justice to the inexhaustible wealth of the West Indian soil and climate. As for the house, which is embowered in the little paradise which I have been describing, I am sorry to say that it is, in general, the merest wooden hut on stilts, the front half altogether open and unwalled, the back half boarded up to form a single room, a passing glance into which will not make the stranger wish to enter, if he has any nose or any dislike of vermin. The group at the door, meanwhile, will do anything but invite him to enter, and he will ride on, with something like a sigh at what man might be and what he is. Doubtless there are great excuses for the inmates. A house in this climate is only needed for a sleeping or lounging place. The cooking is carried on between a few stones in the garden, the washing at the neighbouring brook. No storerooms are needed, where there is no winter and everything grows fresh, save the salt fish, which can be easily kept, and I understand usually is kept, underneath the bed. As for separate bedrooms for boys and girls, and all those decencies and moralities for which those who build model cottages strive, and with good cause, of such things none dream. But it is not very long ago that the British Isles were not perfect in such matters. Some think that they are not quite perfect yet. So we will take the beam out of our own eye before we try to take the mote from the Negroes. The latter, however, no man can do, For the negro, being a freeholder and the owner of his own cottage, must take the mote out of his own eye, having no landlord to build cottages for him. In the meanwhile, however, the less said about his lodging, the better. In the villages, however, the Maraval, for instance, you see houses of a far better stamp, belonging, I believe, to coloured people employed in trades. Long and low wooden buildings with jalousies instead of windows, for no glass is needed here, divided into rooms and smart with paint, which is not as pretty as the native wood. You catch sight as you pass of prints, usually devotional, on the walls, comfortable furniture, looking-glasses and sideboards, and other pleasant signs that a civilization of the middle classes is springing up, and springing, to judge from the number of new houses building everywhere, very rapidly, as befits a colony whose revenue has risen since 1855 from £72,300 to £240,000, beside the local taxation of the wards, some £30,000 or £40,000 or more. What will be the future of agriculture in the West Indian colonies, I, of course, dare not guess. The profits of sugar growing, in spite of all drawbacks, have been of late very great. They will be greater still under the improved methods of manufacture which will be employed now that the sugar duties have been at least rationally reformed by Mr. Lowe. And therefore, for some time to come, capital will naturally flow toward sugar planting, and great sheets of the forest will be, too probably, ruthlessly and wastefully swept away to make room for canes. And yet one must ask regretfully, are there no other cultures save that of cane which will yield a fair, even an ample return to men of small capital and energetic habits? What of the culture of bamboo for paper fibre, of which I have spoken already? It has been, I understand, taken up successfully in Jamaica to supply the United States paper market. Why should it not be taken up in Trinidad? Why should not plantain meal be hereafter largely exported for the use of the English working classes? Why should not Trinidad and other islands export fruits, preserved fruits especially? Surely such a trade might be profitable if only a quarter as much care were taken in the West Indies as is taken in England to improve the varieties by selection and culture, and care taken also not to spoil the preserves as now for the English market by swamping them with sugar or sling. Can nothing be done in growing the oil-producing seeds with which the tropics abound, and for which a demand is rising in England, if it be only for use about machinery? Nothing, too, toward growing drugs for the home market, nothing toward using the treasures of gutta percha which are now wasting in the Balattas. Above all, can nothing be done to increase the yield of the cacao farms and the quality of Trinidad cacao? For this latter industry at least I have hope. My friend, if he will allow me to call him so, Mr. John Law, has shown what extraordinary returns may be obtained from improved cacao growing, at least so far to his own satisfaction that he is himself trying the experiment. He calculates that 200 acres at a maximum outlay of about $11,000 spread over 6 years and diminishing from that time till the end of the 10th year should give, for 50 years after that, a net income of $6,800, and then the industrious planter may sit down, as I heartily hope Mr. Law will do, and enjoy the fruits of his labour. Mr. Law is of the opinion that, to give such a return, the cacao must be farmed in a very different way from the usual plan. that the trees must not be left shaded, as now, by bois immortels, 60 to 80 feet high during their whole life. The trees, he says with reason, impoverish the soil by their roots. The shade causes excessive moisture, chills, weakens and retards the plants, encourages parasitic moss and insects, and moreover is less useful in the very months in which the sun is hottest, viz. February, March and April, which are just the months in which the bois immortels shed their leaves. He believes that the cacao needs no shade after the 3rd year, and that till then shade would be amply given by plantains and maize set between the trees, which would in the very first year repay the planter some $6,500 on his first outlay of some $8,000. It is not for me to give an opinion upon the correctness of his estimates, but the past history of Trinidad shows so many failures of the cacao crop that even a practically ignorant man may be excused for guessing that there is something wrong in the old Spanish system, and that with cacao, as with wheat and every other known crop, improved culture means improved produce and steadier profits. As an advocate of petite culture, I heartily hope that such may be the case. I have hinted in these volumes my belief that exclusive sugar cultivation on the large scale has been the bane of the West Indies. I went out thither with a somewhat foregone conclusion in that direction, but it was at least founded on what I believed to be the facts, and it was certainly verified by the fresh facts which I saw there. I returned with a belief stronger than ever that exclusive sugar cultivation had put a premium on unskilled slave labour, to the disadvantage of skilled white labour, and the disadvantage also of any attempt to educate and raise the Negro, whom it was not worth while to civilize, as long as he was needed merely as an instrument exerting brute strength. It seems to me also that to the exclusive cultivation of sugar is owing, more than to any other cause, that frightful decrease throughout the islands of the white population, of which most English people are, I believe, quite unaware. Do they know, for instance, that Barbados could in Cromwell's time send 3,000 white volunteers to St. Kitts and St. Nevis 1,000, to help in the gallant conquest of Jamaica? Do they know that in 1676 Barbados was reported to maintain, as against 80,000 black, 70,000 free whites, while in 1851 the island contained more than 120,000 Negroes and people of colour, as against only 15,824 whites? That St. Kitts held, even as late as 1761, 7,000 whites, but in 1826, before emancipation, only 1,600. Or that little Montserrat, which held, about 1648, 1,000 white families and had a militia of 360 effective men, held in 1787 only 1,300 whites, in 1828 only 315, and in 1851 only 150. It will be said that this ugly decrease in the white population is owing to the unfitness of the climate. I believe it to have been produced rather by the introduction of sugar cultivation, at which the white man cannot work. These early settlers had grants of 10 acres apiece, at least in Barbados. They grow not only provisions enough for themselves, but tobacco, cotton and indigo, products now all but obliterated out of the British Islands. They made cotton hammocks and sold them abroad as well as in the island. They might, had they been wisely educated to perceive and use the natural wealth around them, have made money out of many other wild products. But the profits of sugar growing were so enormous, in spite of their uncertainty, that during the greater part of the 18th century their little freeholds were bought up and converted into cane pieces by their wealthier neighbours, who could afford to buy slaves and sugar mills. They sought their fortunes in other lands, and so was exterminated a race of yeomen who might have been at this day a source of strength and honour, not only to the colonies but to England herself. It may be that the extermination was not altogether undeserved, that they were not sufficiently educated or skilful to carry out that petite culture which requires, as I have said already, not only intellect and practical education, but a hereditary and traditional experience, such as is possessed by the Belgians, the Piedmontese, and, above all, by the charming peasantry of Provence and Languedoc, the fathers, as far as Western Europe is concerned, of all our agriculture. It may be, too, that as the sugar cultivation increased, they were tempted more and more in the old hard drinking days by the special poison of the West Indies, new rum, to the destruction both of soul and body. Be that as it may, their extirpation helped to make inevitable the vicious system of large estates cultivated by slaves, a system which is judged by its own results, for it was ruinate before emancipation, and emancipation only gave the coup de grace, latifunda perdidere, the Antilles, as they did Italy of old. The vicious system brought its own nemesis. The ruin of the West Indies at the end of the Great French War was principally owing to that exclusive cultivation of the cane, which forced the planter to depend on a single article of produce and left him embarrassed every time prices fell suddenly, or the canes failed from drought or hurricane. We all know what would be thought of an European farmer who thus staked his capital on one venture. He is a bad farmer, says the proverb, who does not stand on 4 legs, and if he can, on 5. If his wheat fails, he has his barley. If his barley, he has his sheep. If his sheep, he has his fattening oxen. The Provençal, the model farmer, can retreat on his almonds if his mulberries fail, on his olives if his vines fail, on his maize if his wheat fails. The West Indian might have had, the Cuban has, his tobacco, his indigo too, his coffee, or, as in Trinidad, his cacao and his arrowroot, and 6 crops more. Indeed, had his intellect, and he had intellect in plenty, been diverted from the fatal fixed idea of making money as fast as possible by sugar, he might have ere now discovered in America, or imported from the East, plants for cultivation far more valuable than breadfruit tree, of which such high hopes were once entertained as a food for the Negro. As it was, his very green crops were neglected till, in some islands at least, he could not feed his cattle and mules with certainty, while the sugar cane, to which everything else had been sacrificed, proved sometimes indeed a valuable servant, but too often a tyrannous and capricious master. But those days are past, and better ones have dawned, with better education and a wider knowledge of the world and of science. What West Indians have to learn, some of them have learnt it already, is that if they can compete with other countries only by improved and more scientific cultivation and manufacture, as they themselves confess, then they can carry out the new methods only by more skilful labour. They therefore require now, as they never required before, to give the labouring classes a practical education, to quicken their intellect and to teach them habits of self-dependent and originative action which are, as in the case of the Prussian soldier and of the English sailor and railway servant, perfectly compatible with strict discipline. Let them take warning from the English manufacturing system, which condemns a human intellect to waste itself in perpetually heading pins or opening and shutting trapdoors, and punishes itself by producing a class of workpeople who alternate between reckless comfort and moody discontent. Let them be sure that they will help rather than injure the labour market of the colony by making the labourer also a small, freeholding peasant. He will learn more in his own provision ground, properly tilled, than he will in the cane piece, and he will take to the cane piece and use for his employer the self-helpfulness which he has learned in the provision ground. It is so in England. Our best agricultural day labourers are, without exception, those who cultivate some scrap of ground or follow some petty occupation which prevents their depending entirely on wage labour. And so I believe it will be in the West Indies. Let the land policy of the late governor be followed up. Let squatting be rigidly forbidden. Let no man hold possession of land without having earned or inherited money enough to purchase it, as a guarantee of his ability and respectability, or, as in the case of coolies past their indentures, as a commutation for rights which he has earned in likewise. But let the coloured man of every race be encouraged to become a landholder and a producer in his own small way. He will thus, not only by what he produces, but by what he consumes, add largely to the wealth of the colony, while his increased wants, and those of his children, till they too can purchase land, will draw him and his sons and daughters to the sugar estates as intelligent and helpful day labourers. So it may be, and I cannot but trust, from what I have seen of the temper of the gentlemen of Trinidad, that so it will be. Chapter 17 and last, Homeward Bound. At last we were homeward bound. We had been 7 weeks in the island. We had promised to be back in England, if possible within the 3 months, and we had a certain pride in keeping our promise, not only for its own sake, but for the sake of the dear West Indies. We wished to show those at home how easy it was to get there, how easy to get home again. Moreover, though going to sea in the Shannon was not quite the same as going to sea in a sieve, our stay-at-home friends were of the same mind as those of the dear little Jumblies, whom Mr. Lear has made immortal in his new book of nonsense, and we were bound to come back as soon as possible, and not in 20 years or more, if we wished them to say, "If we live, we too will go to sea in a sieve, to the hills of the Chankly Bore." So we left. But it was sore leaving. People had been very kind and were ready to be kinder still, while we, busy perhaps, too busy, over our natural history collections, had seen very little of our neighbours, had been able to accept very few of the invitations which were showered on us, and which would, I doubt not, have given us opportunities for liking the islanders still more than we liked them already. Another cause made our leaving sore to us. The hunger for travel had been aroused, above all for travel westward, and would not be satisfied. Up the Orinoco we longed to go, but could not. To La Guaira and Caracas we longed to go, but dared not. Thanks to Spanish Republican barbarism, the only regular communication with that once magnificent capital of northern Venezuela was by a filthy steamer. the Regos Ferreos, which had become, from her very looks, a byword in the port. On board of her some friends of ours had lately been glad to sleep in a dog hutch on deck, to escape the filth and vermin of the berths, and went hungry for want of decent food. Caracas itself was going through one of its periodic revolutions. It has not got through the fever fit yet, and neither life nor property was safe. But the longing to go westward was on us nevertheless. It seemed hard to turn back after getting so far along the great path of the human race, and one had to reason with oneself. Foolish soul, whither would you go? You cannot go westward forever. If you go up the Orinoco, you will long to go up the Meta. If you get to Santa Fe de Bogota, you will not be content till you cross the Andes and see Cotopaxi and Chimborazo. When you look down on the Pacific, you will be craving to go to the Galapagos after Darwin, and then to the Marquesas after Herman Melville, and then to Fijis after Seaman, and then to Borneo after Brooke, and then to Archipelago after Wallace, and then to Hindustan and round the world. And when you get home, the westward fever will be stronger on you than ever, and you will crave to start again. Go home at once like a reasonable man, and do your duty and thank God for what you have been allowed to see, and try to become of the same mind as that most brilliant of old ladies who boasted that she had not been abroad since she saw the apotheosis of Voltaire before the French Revolution, and did not care to go as long as all manner of clever people were kind enough to go instead and write charming books about what they had seen for her. But the westward fever was slow to cool, and with wistful eyes we watched the sun by day and Venus and the moon by night sink down into the gulf to lighten lands which we should never see. A few days more, and we were steaming out to the Bocas, which we had begun to love as the gates of a new home, heaped with presents to the last minute, some of them from persons we hardly knew. Behind us, Port of Spain sank into haze, and before us Monos rose, tall, dark, and grim, if Monos could be grim, in moonless night. We ran on and past the island. This time we were going not through the Boca de Monos, but through the next, the Umbrella Bocas. It was too dark to see houses, palm trees, aught but the ragged outline of the hills against the northern sky, and beneath sparks of light in sheltered coves, some of which were already to one of us well-beloved nooks. There was the great gulf of the Boca de Monos. There was Morrison's, our good Scotch host of 7 weeks since, and the glasses were turned on it to see, if possible, through the dusk, the almond tree and the cocoa grove for the last time. Ah well, when we next meet, what will he be, and where the handsome Creole wife, and the little brown Cupid who danced all naked in the log canoe till the white gentleman swimming round upset him, and canoe, and boy, and men rolled and splashed about like a shoal of seals at play beneath the cliffs with the seguines and sereurs, while the ripple lapped the Maurice nuts about the roots of the manchineel bush, and the skippers leaped and flashed outside like silver splinters. And here, where we steamed along, was the very spot where we had seen the shark's back fin, when we rowed back from the first Guacharo cave, and it was all over. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and as in a dream, or rather as part of a dream, and myself a phantom and a play actor, I looked out over the side and saw on the right the black veils of Monos, On the left, the black walls of Huevos, a gate even grander, though not as narrow, as that of Monos, and the umbrella rock capped with matapalo and cactus, and night-blowing cereus dim in the dark. And now we were outside. The roar of the surf, the tumble of the sea, the rush of the trade wind told us that at once. Out in the great sea with Granada and kind friends in it, ahead, not to be seen or reached till morning light. But we looked astern and not ahead. We could see into and through the gap in Huevos through which we had tried to reach the Guacharo cave. Inside that notch in the cliffs must be the wooded bay whence we picked up the shells among the fallen leaves and flowers. From under that dark wall beyond it, the Guacharos must be just trooping out for their nightly forage, as they had trooped out since. He alone who made them knows how long. The outline of Huevos, the outline of Monos, were growing lower and greyer astern. A long, ragged haze, far loftier than that on the starboard quarter, signified the northern mountains, and far off on the port quarter lay a flat bank of cloud, amid which rose, or seemed to rise, the Cordillera of the main, and the hills where jaguars lie. Canopus blazed high astern, and Fomalhaut below him to the west, as if bidding us a kind farewell. Orion and Aldebaran spangled the zenith. The young moon lay on her back in the far west, thin and pale, over Cumana and the Cordillera, with Venus ragged and red, with earth mist just beneath. And low ahead, with the pointers horizontal, glimmered the cold pole star, for which we were steering, out of the summer into the winter once more. We grew chill as we looked at him, and shuddered, it may be cowered for a moment, at the thought of Niflheim, the home of frosts and fogs, towards which we were bound. However, we were not yet out of the tropics. We had still nearly a fortnight before us in which to feel sure there was a sun in heaven, a fortnight more of the warm champagne atmosphere which was giving fresh life and health to us both. And up the islands we went, wiser, but not sadder, than when we went down them, casting wistful eyes, though, to windward, for there away, and scarcely out of sight, lay Tobago, to which we had a most kind invitation. And gladly would we have looked at that beautiful and fertile little spot, and have pictured to ourselves Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday pacing along the coral beach in one of its little southern coves. More wistfully still did we look to windward when we thought of Barbados, and of the kind people who were ready to welcome us into that prosperous and civilized little cane garden which deserves, and has deserved for now 200 years, far more than poor old Ireland, the name of the emerald gem of the Western world. But it could not be. A few hours at Granada and a few hours at St. Lucia were all the stoppages possible to us. The steamer only passes once a fortnight, and it is necessary to spend that time on each island which is visited, unless the traveller commits himself, which he cannot well do if he has a lady with him, to the chances and changes of coasting schooners. More frequent and easy intercommunication is needed throughout the Antilles. The good people, whether white or coloured, need to see more of each other and more of visitors from home. Whether a small weekly steamer between the islands would pay in money, I know not. That it would pay morally and socially, I am sure. Perhaps, when the telegraph is laid down along the islands, the need of more steamers, will be felt and supplied. Very pleasant it was, the run-up to St. Thomas's, not merely on account of the scenery, but because we had once more, contrary to our expectation, the most agreeable of captains. His French cultivation, he had been brought up in Provence, joined to brilliant natural talents, had made him as good a talker as he doubtless is a sailor, and the charm of his conversation about all matters on earth, and some above the earth, will not be soon forgotten by those who went up with him to St. Thomas's and left him there with regret. We transhipped to the Neva. Captain Woolwood, to whom I must tender my thanks, as I do to Captain Bax of the Shannon, for all kinds of civility. We slept a night in the harbour, the town having just then a clean bill of health, and were very glad to find ourselves during the next few days none the worse for having done so. On remarking the first evening that I did not smell the harbour after all, I was comforted by the answer that when a man did, he had better go below and make his will. It is a pity that the most important harbour in the Caribbean Sea should be so unhealthy. No doubt it offers advantages for traffic which can be found nowhere else, and there the steamers must continue to assemble, yellow fever or none. But why should not an hotel be built for the passengers in some healthy and airy spot outside the basin? On the slope of Water Island, for instance, or on Buck Island, where they might land at once and sleep in pure fresh air and sea breeze. The establishment of such an hotel would surely, when once known, attract to the West Indies many travellers to whom St. Thomas's is now as much a name of fear as Colon or the Panama. We left St. Thomas's by a different track from that which we came to it. We ran northwards up the magnificent landlocked channel between Tortola and Virgin Gorda, to pass to leeward of Virgin Gorda and Anegada, and so northward toward the Gulf Stream. This channel has borne the name of Drake, I presume, ever since the year 1575, for in the account of that fatal though successful voyage, which cost the lives both of Sir John Hawkins, who died off Puerto Rico, and Sir Francis Drake, who died off Portobello, where Hosier and the greater part of the crews of a noble British fleet perished 150 years afterward, it is written in Hakluyt how, after running up north and northwest past Saba, the fleet stood away southwest, and on the 8th of November, being a Saturday, we came to an anchor some 7 or 8 leagues off among certain broken islands called Las Virgines, which have been accounted dangerous, but we found there a very good road. Had it been for 1,000 sails of ships in 7 and 8 fathoms, fine sand, good anchorage, high islands on either side, but no fresh water that we could find. Here is much fish to be taken with nets and hooks. Also we stayed on shore and fouled. Here Sir John Hawkins was extreme sick. He died within 10 days, which his sickness began upon news of the taking of the Francis, his sternmost vessel. The 18th day we weighed and stood north and by east into a lesser sound, which Sir Francis in his barge discovered the night before, and anchored in 13 fathoms, having high steep hills on either side, some league distance from our first riding. The 12 in the morning we weighed and set sail into the sea due south through a small strait, but without danger, possibly the very gap in which the Rhone's wreck now lies, and then stowed west and by north for San Juan de Puerto Rico. This northerly course is, plainly, the most advantageous for a homeward-bound ship, as it strikes the Gulf Stream soonest and keeps in it longest. Conversely, the southerly route by the Azores is best for outward bound ships, as it escapes most of the Gulf Stream and traverses the still Sargasso Sea and even the extremity of the westward equatorial current. Strange as these Virgin Isles had looked when seen from the south, outside and at the distance of a few miles, they looked still more strange when we were fairly threading our way between them, sometimes not a rifle shot from the cliffs, with the white coral banks gleaming under our keel. Had they ever carried a tropic vegetation? Had the hills of Tortola and Virgin Gorda, in shape and size much like those which surround a sea loch in the Western Islands, ever been furred with forests like those of Guadeloupe or St. Lucia? The loftier were now mere mounds of almost barren earth. The lower were often like fallen Jerusalem, mere long earthless moles as of minute cyclopean masonry. But what had destroyed their vegetation, if it ever existed? Were they not, too, the mere remnants of a submerged and destroyed land, connected now only by coral shoals? So it seemed to us as we ran out past the magnificent harbour at the back of Virgin Gorda, where, in the older war times, the merchantmen of all the West Indies used to collect to be conveyed homeward by the naval squadron, and across a shallow sea white with coral beds. We passed to leeward of the island, or rather reef, of Anegada, so low it could only be discerned at a few miles distant, by breaking surf and a few bushes, and then plunged, as it were, suddenly out of shallow white water into deep azure ocean. An upheaval of only 40 fathoms would, I believe, join all these islands to each other, and to the great mountain island of Puerto Rico to the west. The same upheaval would connect with each other Anguilla, St. Martin and St. Bartholomew to the east. But Santa Cruz, though so near St. Thomas's and the Virgin Gordas to the south, would still be parted from them by a gulf nearly 2,000 fathoms deep, a gulf which marks still, probably, the separation of two ancient continents, or at least two archipelagos. Much light has been thrown on this curious problem since our return by an American naturalist, Mr. Bland, in a paper read before the American Philosophical Society on the geology and physical geography of the West Indies, with reference to the distribution of mollusca. It is plain that of all animals, land shells and reptiles give the surest tokens of any former connection of islands, being neither able to swim nor fly from one to another, and very unlikely to be carried by birds or currents. Judging, therefore, as he has a right to do, by the similarity of the land shells, Mr. Bland is of opinion that Puerto Rico, the Virgins and the Anguilla group once formed continuous dry land, connected with Cuba, the Bahamas and Haiti, and that their shell fauna is of a Mexican and Central American type. The shell fauna of the islands to the south, on the contrary, from Barbuda and St. Kitts down to Trinidad, is South American, but of two types, one Venezuelan, the other Guianan. It seems, from Mr. Bland's researches, that there must have existed once not merely an extension of the North American continent southeastward, but that very extension of the South American continent northwards, at which I have hinted more than once in these pages. Moreover, a fact which I certainly did not expect, the western side of this supposed land, namely Trinidad, Tobago, Grenada, the Grenadines, St. Vincent and St. Lucia, have, as far as land shells are concerned, a Venezuelan fauna, while the eastern side of it, namely Barbados, Martinique, Dominica, Guadeloupe, Antigua, etc., have strangely the fauna of Guyana. If this be so, A glance at the map will show the vast destruction of tropic land during almost the very last geological epoch, and show too how little in the present imperfect state of our knowledge we ought to dare any speculations as to the absence of man, as well as other creatures, on those great lands now destroyed. For, to supply the dry land which Mr. Bland's theory needs, we shall have to conceive a junction reaching over at least 5 degrees of latitude, between the north of British Guiana and Barbados, and may freely indulge in the dream that the waters of the Orinoco, when they ran over the lowlands of Trinidad, passed east of Tobago, then northwards between Barbados and St. Lucia, then turned westward between the latter island and Martinique, and that the mighty estuary formed, for a great part at least of that line, the original barrier which kept the land shells of Venezuela apart from those of Guiana. A stretch of the imagination doubtless, but no greater stretch than will be required by any explanation of the facts whatsoever. And so, thanking Mr. Bland heartily for his valuable contribution to the infant science of biogeology, I take leave in these pages at least of the earthly paradise. Our run homeward was quite as successful as our run out. The magnificent Neva, her captain and her officers were what these Royal Mail steamers and their crews are, without, I believe, an exception, all that we could wish. Our passengers certainly were neither so numerous nor so agreeable as when going out, and the most notable personage among them was a keen-eyed, strong-jawed little Corsican who had been lately hired, so ran the story, by the coloured insurgents of Haiti to put down the president, alias, as usual in such republics, Tyrant Salnav. He seemed, by his own account, to have done his work effectually. 7,000 lives were lost in the attack on Salnav's quarters in Port-au-Prince. Whole families were bayoneted to save the trouble of judging and shooting them. Women were not spared, and, if all that I have heard of Haiti be true, some of them did not deserve to be spared. The noble old French buildings of the city were ruined, the Corsican said, not by his artillery but by Salnav's. He had slain Salnav himself, and was now going back to France to claim his rights as a French citizen, carrying with him Salnav's sword, which was wrapped in a newspaper, save when taken out to be brandished on the main deck. One could not but be interested in the valiant adventurer. He seemed a man such as red republics and revolutions breed and need, very capable of doing rough work and not likely to be hampered by scruples as to the manner of doing it. If he is, as I take for granted, busy in France just now, he will leave his mark behind. The voyage, however, seemed likely to be a dull one, and to relieve the monotony a wild beast show was determined on, ere the weather grew too cold. So one day all the new curiosities were brought on deck at noon, and if some great zoologist had been on board, he would have found materials in our show for more than one interesting lecture. The doctor contributed an alligator, some 2 feet 6 inches long. Another officer, a curiously marked anteater, of a species unknown to me. It was common, he said, in the Isthmus of Panama, and seemed the most foolish and helpless of beasts. As no ants were procurable, it was fed on raw yolk of egg, which it contrived to suck in with its long tongue. Not enough, however, to keep it alive during the voyage. The chief engineer exhibited a live tarantula, or bird-catching spider, who was very safely barred into its box with strips of iron, as a bite from it is rather worse than that of an English adder. We showed a vulturine parrot and a kinkajou. The kinkajou, by the by, got loose one night and displayed his natural inclination by instantly catching a rat and dancing between decks with it in his mouth, but was so tame withal that he let the stewardess stroke him in passing. The good lady mistook him for a cat, and when she discovered next morning that she had been handling a loose wild beast, her horror was as great as her thankfulness for her supposed escape. In curious contrast to the natural tameness of the kinkajou was the natural untamedness of a beautiful little night monkey belonging to the purser. Its great owl's eyes were instinct with nothing but abject terror of everybody and everything, and it was a miracle that ere the voyage was over it did not die of mere fright. How is it, en passant, that some animals are naturally fearless and tameable, others are not, and that even in the same family? Among the South American monkeys the howlers are untamable, the sapajous less so, while the spider monkeys are instinctively gentle and fond of man, as may be seen in the case of the very fine Miramonda, Atelas Beelzebub, now dying, I fear, in the zoological gardens at Bristol. As we got into colder latitudes, we began to lose our pets. The anteater departed first. Then the doctor, who kept his alligator in a tub on his cabin floor, was awoke by doleful wails as of a babe. Being pretty sure that there was not likely to be one on board, and certainly not in his cabin, he naturally struck a light and discovered the alligator, who had never uttered a sound before, outside his tub on the floor, bewailing bitterly his fate. Whether he wept crocodile tears besides, the doctor could not discover, but it was at least clear that if swans sing before they die, alligators do so likewise, for the poor thing was dead next morning. It was time after this to stow the pets warm between decks and as near the galley fires as they could be put, for now, as we neared the roaring 40s, there fell on us a gale from the northwest and would not cease. The wind was, of course, right abeam. The sea soon ran very high. The Neva, being a long screw, was lively enough, and too lively, for she soon showed a chronic inclination to roll, and that suddenly by fits and starts. The fiddles were on the tables for nearly a week, but they did not prevent more than one of us finding his dinner suddenly in his lap instead of off his stomach. However, no one was hurt, nor even frightened, save two poor ladies, not from Trinidad, who spent their doleful days and nights in screaming, telling their beads, drinking weak brandy and water, and informing the hunted stewardess that if they had known what horrors they were about to endure, they would have gone to Europe in a sailing vessel. The foreigners, who are usually, I know not why, bad sailors, soon vanished to their berths. So did the ladies. Even those who were not ill jammed themselves into their berths, and lay there for fear of falls and bruises, while the Englishman and a coloured man or two, the coloured men usually stand the sea well, had the deck all to themselves, and slopped about holding on and longing for a monkey's tail, but on the whole rather liking it. For after all, it is a glorious pastime to find oneself in a real gale of wind, in a big ship, with not a rock to run against within 1,000 miles. One seems in danger, and one is so safe, and gradually the sense of security grows, and grows into a sense of victory, as with the boy who fears his first fence, plucks up his heart for the second, is rather pleased at the third, and craves for the triumph of the fourth, and of all the rest, sorry at last when the run is over. And when a man, not being seasick, has once discovered that the apparent heel of the ship in rolling is at least 4 times less than it looks, and that she will jump upright again in 1/4 of a minute, like a fisher's float, has learnt to get his trunk out from under his berth, and put it back again by jamming his forehead against the berth side and his heels against the ship's wall, has learnt, if he sleeps aft, to sleep through the firing of the screw, though it does shake all the marrow in his backbone, and has, above all, made a solemn vow to shave and bathe every morning. Let the ship be as lively as she will, then he will find a full gale, a finer tonic and a finer stir, a wholesome appetite, than all the drugs of apothecary's hall. This particular gale, however, began to get a little too strong. We had a sail or two set to steady the ship. On the second night one split with a crack like a cannon, and was tied up in an instant, cordage and strips, into inextricable knots. The next night I was awoke by a slap which shook the Neva from stem to stern, and made her stagger and writhe like a live thing struck across the loins, when a dull rush of water which there was no mistaking. We had shipped a green sea. Well, I could not bail it out again, and there was plenty of room for it on board. So after ascertaining that R was not frightened, I went back to my berth and slept again, somewhat wondering that the roll of the screw was all but silent. Next morning we found that a sea had walked in over the bridge, breaking it and washing off it the first officer and the lookout man. Luckily they fell into a sail and not overboard, put out the galley fires so that we got a cold breakfast, and eased the ship, for the shock turned the indicator in the engine room to ease her. The engineer, thinking that the captain had given the order, obeyed it. The captain turned out into the wet to know who had eased his ship, and then returned to bed, wisely remarking that the ship knew her own business best, and as she had chosen to ease the engines herself, ease she should be, his orders being not to prosecute a voyage so as to endanger the lives of the passengers or the property of the company. So we went on easily for 16 hours, the wise captain judging, and his judgment proved true, that the centre of the storm was crossing our course ahead, and that if we waited it would pass us. So, as he expected, we came after a day or two into an almost windless sea, where smooth mountainous waves, the relics of the storm, were weltering aimlessly up and down under a dark sky. Soon we began to sight ship after ship, and found ourselves on the great southwestern high road of the Atlantic, and found ourselves, too, nearing Niflheim day by day. Colder and colder grew the wind, lower the sun, darker the cloud world overhead, and we went on deck each morning with some additional garment on, sorely against our wills. Only on the very day on which we sighted land, we had one of those treacherously beautiful days which occur now and then in an English February, mild, still, and shining, if not with keen, joyful blaze, at least with a cheerful and tender gleam from sea and sky. The Land's End was visible at a great distance, and as we neared the Lizard we could see not only the lighthouses on the cliff, and every well-known cove and rock from Mullion and Kynance round to St. Keverne, but far inland likewise, Brieg Church and the great tin works of Wheal Vor stood out hard against the sky. We could see up the Low Pool to Helston Church, and away beyond it, till we fancied that we could almost discern across the isthmus the sacred hill of Carnbrae. Along the Cornish shore we ran, through a sea swarming with sails, an exciting contrast to the loneliness of the wide ocean which we had left, and so on to Plymouth Sound. The last time I had been on that water, I was looking up in awe at Sir Edward Codrington's fleet just home from the Battle of Navarino. Even then, as a mere boy, I was struck by the grand symmetry of that ample basin, the breakwater, then unfinished, lying across the centre, the heights of Bovisand and Corsand, and those again of Mountbatten and Mount Edgecombe, left and right, the citadel and the Hoe across the bottom of the Sound, the southern sun full on their walls, with the twin harbours and their forests of masts, winding away into dim distance on each side, and beyond all and above all, the purple range of Dartmoor, with the black rain clouds crawling along its top. And now, after nearly 40 years, the place looked to me even more grand than my recollections had pictured it. The newer fortifications have added to the moral effect of the scene, without taking away from its physical beauty, and I heard without surprise, though not without pride, the foreigners express their admiration of this, their first specimen of an English port. We steamed away again after landing our letters, close past the dear old Mewstone. The Warreners' hut stood on it still, and I wondered whether the old he-goat who used to terrify me as a boy had left any long-bearded descendants. Then under the Revelstoke and Bolthead cliffs, with just one flying glance up into the hidden nooks of delicious little Salcombe, and away southwest into the night, bound for Cherbourg and a very different scene. We were awakened soon after midnight by the stopping of the steamer. Then a gun. After a while another, and presently a third. But there was no reply, though our coming had been telegraphed from England, and for nearly 6 hours we lay in the heart of the most important French arsenal, with all our mails and passengers waiting to get ashore, and nobody deigning to notice us. True, we could do no harm there, but our delay and other things which happened were proofs, and I was told not uncommon ones, of that carelessness, unreadiness, and general indiscipline of French arrangements, which has helped to bring about, since then, an utter ruin. As the day dawned through fog, we went on deck to find the ship lying inside a long breakwater bristling with cannon, which looked formidable enough. But the whole thing, I was told, was useless against modern artillery and ironclads, and there was more than one jest on board as to the possibility of running the Channel Squadron across and smashing Cherbourg in a single night, unless the French learned to keep a better lookout in time of war than they did in time of peace. Just inside us lay 2 or 3 ironclads, strong and ugly, untidy too, to a degree shocking to English eyes. All sorts of odds and ends were hanging over the side, and about the rigging the yards were not properly squared, and so forth, till, as old sailors would say, the ships had no more decency about them than so many collier brigs. Beyond them were arsenals, docks, fortifications of which, of course, we could not judge, and backing all a cliff, some 200 feet high, much quarried for building stone. An ugly place it is to look at, and I should think an ugly place to get into, with the wind anywhere between northwest and northeast. An artificial and expensive luxury, built originally as a mere menace to England in days when France, which has had too long a moral mission to right someone, thought of fighting us, who only wished to live in peace with our neighbours. Alas, alas, tu l'as voulu, Georges Dandin. She has fought at last, but not us. Out of Cherbourg we steamed again, sulky enough, for the delay would cause us to get home on the Sunday evening instead of the Sunday morning, and ran northward for the Needles. With what joy we saw at last the white wall of the island glooming dim ahead. With what joy we first discerned that huge outline of a visage on freshwater cliff, so well known to sailors, which, as the eye catches it in one direction, is a ridiculous caricature, in another really noble and even beautiful. With what joy did we round the old Needles and run past Hurst Castle, and with what shivering too, for the wind, though dead south, came to us as a continental wind, harsh and keen from off the frozen land of France, and chilled us to the very marrow all the way up to Southampton. But there were warm hearts and kind faces waiting us on the quay, and good news too. The gentleman at the custom house courteously declined the least inspection of our luggage, and we were at once away in the train home. At first, I must confess, an English winter was a change for the worse. Fine old oaks and beeches looked to us fresh from Cebus and Bellatas, like leafless brooms stuck into the ground by their handles, while the want of light was for some days painful and depressing. But we had done it, and within the 3 months, as we promised. As the king in the old play says, "What has been, has been. I've had my hour." At last we had seen it, and we could not unsee it. We could not have been in the tropics.